love
Those shows
yeah.
like Mary Poppins.
It was just accessible. It was accessible to me to see white feminists pushing at a system I knew was fucked up. But then, so I'm saying, what do you mean, and why was I fucked up? Feminism and I are calling this the fuck feminism phase.
Feminist phase. But there's a trajectory, don't worry.
Yes, there's a trajectory. So like as I became more conscious and started realizing, okay, the systems are fucked, as is the school system, I started like looking for different answers. And I was reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And I had a librarian who pushed me in the direction of reading sci-fi fantasy that wasn't just written by old white dudes. But even when I read sci-fi fantasy by old white dudes, the thing that stuck with me was subverting the system. And what I realized is that a lot of the feminism I was exposed to did not subvert a system. It actually upheld it. White feminism is regularly used to justify the bombing of people that look like me. I remember the first time I heard the narrative, we must bomb Afghanistan to free the women there from the horrible clutches of Islam. And I remember being like, I'm not Muslim, but I grew up in a Muslim community. It's part of my culture. And that doesn't seem right. There's something wrong here. And then I became conscious to the ways that U.S. imperialism pays for extremism of any religion. I became conscious of all these things. But I just was realizing that white feminism was specifically used as a tool to kill people that look like me. And I became particularly conscious of that after 9/11. Because one of the targets of white feminism was my dad. I love my father. In Palestinian culture, women are held up here, like deeply revered as educators, people who like taking care of the kids is seen as an important job because the kids are our future. My dad, I used to help him fix cars, I used to take out the trash. Like I never had a gender role handed down to me by my father that matched what white feminists said my gender role in my culture would be. And after 9/11, when my house got TP'd, people started calling my dad a terrorist, calling us terrorists, but specifically we had like phone calls threatening my father with death. It was heart-wrenching. And this narrative of fuck all men and watching my dad be a victim of this narrative I was done. I was absolutely done. And it was around at this time I discovered feminism, but I'm gonna hold on to that because I know we're gonna move further. But at that time I was just like, yeah, feminism is not for me, but not from like a conservative Texas Republican lens, which is another place you can find that, but it wasn't for me because it was specifically harming my dad, people and other people that I love.
It's so interesting because in the time that I've known you, like I feel like I know a decent amount about you, but I also still learn a whole bunch in this very moment, which is really lovely and also heartbreaking. So for me, I think I would say I had sort of a similar trajectory in some ways, that I also was sort of in a place where I was like, some of this stuff doesn't make sense, right? Like, I was hearing things that I was like, this doesn't really make sense to me, right? But I didn't have language for it. And so when I got to college, I kept finding people who were like loud thinkers like myself. And so like, someone would say something in class and I would be sort of like, I don't know, right? But I would see someone else who would be like, I don't know. And like connecting with them, like they were majors in feminist studies. And like my school had a feminist studies major. They do not have that anymore, but they did. And at the time it was like, I don't know, the first school that had a feminist studies major, oldest, something or other. And I just kept meeting people who were cool and who seemed similar to me, who were related to that major. And I also I just started taking like all these classes that are related to like the questions that I was having, the things I was curious about, and they were all cross-listed in feminist studies. And so it was a way for me to feminism allowed me to find some camaraderie, which I did not have and needed. And also for me to make some connections to things about the stuff that I was curious about and wanted to make changes. So that was super important and helpful to me. And I would say I also had sort of the situation of being there's also parts of this what we now call white feminism that are like kind of weird, because I remember actually being in school and being in like feminist studies course, and and like people coming, like someone came to class, and this woman was just bereft, and she was just like, oh, I saw this diamond commercial, and like the way that they are like oppressing women is just so horrible. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? It's just like, why are they forcing diamond on the hand? You know what I mean? I was like, is that the part that we are supposed to be? You know what I mean? Like, there were some things where I was like, well, we're not thinking about where the diamond came from, or you know what I mean? Like, there's some connections that seem missing. And there was like a day where, I know there was a day, and I want to be honest also about the fact, like, there were some things that I bought. I fully bought into it. That, like, there was a day where, like, we had sort of this lesson, and all of us were just, like, so upset because we were just like, oh my God, our mothers are oppressed. Right? Which in hindsight is just like, a little questionable, right? But there was this, but I remember people being just like so upset and being like, my mother made us dinner multiple days a week. Like, oh, I just feel so bad for her. She's so oppressed. She doesn't even know it, right? Which again is also just like, so there was a way in which we were buying something that was not giving us a full picture, which we would now call a brand of white feminism. We would now call something that does not have a race and class and capitalism analysis. I would say for me, the feminism phase was, I went to work as an organizer for the 2004 March for Women's Lives, Free Throw March in DC. And I was so excited about it. Like, I felt like it was my dream job. My boss basically, like, I had like 24 hours of interviews with different people, took me all around the city, bought me lunch. Now, it wasn't an expensive lunch. No, it was not an expensive right, but I felt like I was like really, really being honored. And like, I just felt, and one of the things my boss said to me was like, it's tough work. It's not necessarily like always, don't always have wins, but I know that I can go to any place in the U.S. and I'll have a place to stay. And so again, there was this like, the community, the friendship, the like, you know what I mean? Like that just felt so important to me because I just felt like a person who had been so alone my whole life. And so it was like, I felt like feminism could change things for me personally and for the world. And that felt huge to me. But also in that same job, on the second day of that job, we went to a networking event at the Embassy of Finland, which again, I was like, wow, all right. And my boss took me home from the embassy to the metro. And I was the only woman of color in the office my boss was with. And she was like, and I felt like I had wined and dined. And my boss said to me specifically, she was like, like we specifically hired you so that you can bring in the women of color to this meeting. And I was like, yeah, shit is smart. And she was like, you're gonna need to work harder and like do more than do your work in addition to what you were hired to do. You're going to also need to do more so you can bring in the women of color to this march, and we really needed to do that. And she was like, do you think you're able to do that? Right?
Yeah, because obviously you're all black person, right?
Well, and not just black. And all women of color was in DC. Come on now. In Johnson City? Get out of here.
Oh my God.
But I honestly at the time I felt so honored. right? Which is the most terrible thing in hindsight. I was like, wow, they trust me. Right? I didn't feel like, wow, this person is totally tokenizing me and I'm working harder than everybody else. I felt like this person trusts me and like this is gonna be the best experience. Obviously it was not. Right? And so, you know, you start to, there's some things that obviously start to unravel, but in that role, you know, you fast forward some months. And part of what you see in, what I saw in that job was that like, this idea of like long-term liberation. And so again, like in that role, I'm working with like all the icons, all the leaders of all the big organizations, NARAL, Planned Parenthood, all of them, right? They're all coming together to do this work. And so what you see is that like, there's this huge amount of power hoarding, and there is like a continuous, like the desire for liberation is gone. The desire for short-term wins always wins, right? Always take the short-term win that's going to get you in the paper. We do not care about the long-term liberation. That's off the table. And power always wins over vision, which means you will never get to liberation. It is, I mean, and so it was so completely heartbreaking to me, right? I mean, and there's so many other wrongs missing, right? Like, if we want to talk about it later, we can talk about it later. But I want to make sure we get to other parts of this conversation. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the important stuff.
God, that makes me so angry. But like I recognize it, right? Like I recognize it in my role in the academy, I recognize it in organizing work. Oh my God. Okay. Do you want to read this part of a poem? So we shared this article with you all, and we want to read 2 parts of it. And I wish I had written down like the page number. Oh, thank you. So the first part is one that spoke to me every time we were reading it because it feels like what white feminism is. And I'll read it out loud. When the hurricane swirled and spread its deluge of dark people onto the good green land, they gloated. The western skies reverberated with joyous accounts. The tree has fallen, the great trunk is smashed, the hurricane leaves no life in the tree. And that's a little bit, as a Palestinian, one of the things that is important to me is land and indigeneity. Like as an indigenous person, part of the most painful thing from colonization is separation from land. And white feminism seemed like it was okay with that separation. That in fact, much like this part of the poem expresses, that destruction of the land is part of the win, instead of recognizing that colonization itself is the patriarchy. That there is something incredibly patriarchy about bombs and building over, like infrastructure as violence. And then the next part, you want to read the next paragraph?
Well, actually, I just wanted to say one thing about that poem for me is that, like, you know, there's this like play between like the hurricane and the tree, and this idea that like we'll do anything to get rid of the hurricane, right? Because the hurricane is a short-term thing. But the tree is a long-term thing, and there's not this thought about like what you lose by like sacrificing the tree for this short-term hurricane, right? And for me, I feel like when we start to think about like what our feminist futures have to look like, that include Palestinian liberation and the liberation of all of us, we have to be thinking about not like it is like the tree philosophy, right? This idea that like the tree's going to be there longer than the hurricane. So like, how do we deal with the hurricane, but also remember that like we need like the tree, and we at least need like the land that the tree is on, right? Like we need to be thinking about that. So yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so another section that we pulled from that article, I want to just read. It says, our analysis will focus on the gendered violence of the Israeli occupation and some of its arms, including the Palestinian Authority. Although this type of analysis is typically regarded as feminist, we also know how feminism has been weaponized against our communities in the global South. when it comes to Palestine, women's rights have been invoked as a reason to invade our lands and dispossess our people, painting Arab and Muslim people, specifically men, as barbaric. So again, that sort of related stream to what you were saying about how men are portrayed, and also how this idea of like, oh, we're gonna drop bombs in Afghanistan in order to free the women, but are you really, right?
Okay. So our next section, sorry, I'm actually like need a pause because like I'm very emotional after reading that paragraph.
Yes.
Because I think about like the role of, you know, it was white women who voted for Trump. I'll just put that on the table. That like as women we have so much power to care. Like I'm not saying this in a gendered way. For me, when I say woman, when I say like mother, when I say, I really mean the act of the feminine idea of nurture and love that anyone can enact regardless of the parts that they were born with, right? And for me, like reading this paragraph is like so heartbreaking because so much of that is then used as a tool to murder the people who are caring for the most nurturing thing of all, which is the land. And your point about like this tree and the deep roots and like holding on to that and the short-term wins. It's like, okay, short-term, now you have these tall buildings and now you have this country, so-called country. But what have we lost? It's not just the Palestinian people, right? And one of the things I often heard growing up was, Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. You know, Israel's freeing everybody. They're helping all the queer people. They're helping all the women. If it's not for Israel, Israel's the only place where women can vote. Besides all of that being not true, just to place that, you know, first and foremost. What we have lost is the true nurturing of the land and the people who know the most about it and are closest to it. So it's just heartbreaking and just very emotional for me. And then this idea of calling Palestinian men barbaric while we're watching them barefoot digging their children out of the rubble in this moment is like very, it's violence. And it's a violence that I recognize that I once lauded, you know, like feminism was up here for me. When I was younger, but the kind of feminism I was describing to was the very same one that is killing Gaza right now, right? So, but it's hard to think about, to like think back on.
Yes. There's Audra Simpson is a indigenous anthropologist, professor, and she writes about how colonialism specifically targets indigenous women because of their connection to the land and because of like what they're holding, right? And so like how colonialism itself is really sort of targeted to like have total control of everything. We can't do that unless, like you can't control the land, everything else, unless you control the body. And in order to do that, like you have to control memory, you have to control reproduction, you have to control all these other things, and like the indigenous, like anyone who's indigenous to the land, connected to the land, that you have to get rid of that connection in order to have that total control.
Okay, but ultimately Meredith and I came back to feminism, and I'm now a proud member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. So why did we do that? What do we mean? What is this new feminism? And I'm going to start off by reading this sentence from the article that I think kind of encapsulates that as we tell this part of the story. The article reads, "We cannot appeal to the state to end gender violence because the state itself carries out violence in the form of prisons, police, and warfare." And for me, as I mentioned earlier, you know, infrastructure is violence. And I believe that feminism, and specifically the idea of identifying the patriarchal ways that infrastructure builds and identifying the feminine and the nurturing as a way to combat that, is for all of us. And I also think it is the highest form of resistance to colonialism and imperialism, to embody that nurturing, that love, that care, and for the ways that indigenous women hold the memory, hold the culture, hold a lot of the answer to what the land is, I truly believe that feminism can provide a response, and has, I shouldn't say could, and has provided a response to colonial violence and the reclamation of feminism.
Yeah, I mean, I think my thought about like how I came back to feminism is sort of like, did I? More in the sense of like, I came back to liberation, and I don't care what you call it, right? Like, I think I'm sort of in the place of like, I feel like the word feminism has tripped up so many people and made so many divisions, and I care about holding the history, particularly of Black queer feminists, who have done so much, and like queer feminists globally, who have done so much and written so much that we really are consistently building on, and honestly doing when we don't even know it. But also in our day-to-day, like, I don't care if you're like, hello, my name is so-and-so and I'm feminist. I don't care, right? But I do care if you are like building radical friendships and like calling your people on the shit. And you know what I mean? And making sure that you are sustaining whatever activism you're doing. That's what brought me back, is like, listen, I don't have to be a part of the establishment to like do the thing and like be feminist in the full way.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I will say, like, liberation is the ultimate goal. And
Totally.
the moment that you mentioned that about that organization where they gave up liberation for those short-term wins. But I do think one of the things that feminism provides that is unique, or that should be in conjunction to all the movements towards liberation, is the analysis of gender.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Like we need disability justice for the analysis of disability, we need queer theory in order to have an analysis for not leaving queer folks behind in our pursuit of liberation. And all of that does seem like a lot. Like at the end of the day, you know, we want to be free of colonial violence. We want to be free of imperialism. But because our minds are so colonized, there is a place, I think, for having very purposeful and intentional discussion about who gets left behind. Because there are many people who work for liberation who walk out and are all very much about like the militarization of liberation. And then there are other people who, you know, will only use one lens. We need a class lens, we need a gender lens, we need all of these different specific things so that we can start to parse apart the way colonization, what it's robbed us of. But at the end of the day, 100%, like, as long as we are working towards liberation, we will get there.
That's such an interesting point too, because I do feel like I personally, and so many people are very tied to their individual portion of essentially what we want feminism to be, right? Then it's like, oh, I work in, you know, disability justice, or I work in this area or this area, right? But I do think it's interesting to think about, like, can they all be under the umbrella, right? Should they? Yes, I think that makes sense that they should. I think most people don't see themselves under the umbrella. So perhaps that's actually part of the feminist future, right? I think a lot of times people are like, oh yeah, well, sometimes we have this Audre Lorde quote, and that's it. And then, you know what I mean? Like, and then we do our work over here because we're, you know, whatever.
That's actually a really important point, that like, you know, just because I see it that way, like I'm not a feminist scholar. I don't know if other people see it that way. I know the Palestinian Feminist Collective does. That's probably because our primary goal is liberation, right? And like this is just one theory or one theoretical analysis we use to understand it.
Yeah.
But there are probably how white feminism came to be is that they've lost liberation as an umbrella. And actually part of, you know, what I do in my day job as a professor, a school psychologist thinking about education, is trying to push everyone who says social justice to think about colonization. Because for me, social justice is under the lens of decolor work, but for a lot of people it's not.
Yes.
So I think that's a really good point, is that like the overall, like the umbrella should be liberation, and if people forget that, then we lose the collective in pursuit of the individual.
Yes. And it's interesting, right? Because I think for me, thinking about colonization is so important, and I know that was part of my education that I really don't think I got as part of a like feminist umbrella. But when I think about it now, I think about colonization in some ways as this like beginning phase. And I don't know if this makes sense, but let's throw it out, see if it does, right? But in some ways, colonization as this like beginning phase, right? So I think about it as like colonization, and then like capitalism as like this way to like expand it, right? Because I particularly coming from like the perspective of somebody who's a descendant of enslaved people, black enslaved people. So like the attempt in colonization of African countries, and then this of African countries and European countries, and then like that European expansion, that colonial expansion, and being like, okay, we need money to keep that expansion. All right, where can we get money, right? And it's like, well, we have resources over here in Africa that we just found, right? So now there's like a land grab, a resource grab, and it's also like, okay, well now we can use also these people as chattel, so that begins this whole other like dislocation. So there's a way in which like colonialism feels like such a first step of such a long-term dislocation. And I would say like for me personally, like I like this in October felt very much like I had experienced this. Like I know I said to you, I was like, this feels like a memory. Even though this is not something that I have personally experienced, this feels like a memory. Which is very strange, but it just felt like this is something that's in my bones. Like there feels like there's something that's just too similar that's happening here. And so there is just, for me, like a feminist future that includes Palestinian liberation and Sudanese liberation and Congolese liberation and Haitian liberation and Hawaiian liberation, Puerto Rican liberation, okay, come on now, right, is one where we really have to be like, okay, how are we actually making the connections between all of these systems and not just being like, oh, is this kind of justice and is this kind of justice and this kind of justice? And it's actually like, okay, we're looking at like the long arc of memory. Because the memory is what's being erased.
Yes.
And that is killing us. That's myself.
Well, I mean, but think about who holds the memory. It's the storyteller.
It is, yes.
And particularly, it's the people who hold the children.
Yes.
Passing on the stories, right?
Yes.
So a Palestinian feminist future has to include decolonization.
Yes.
It has to also connect all of these things while keeping in mind and uplifting both women and from identifying people and fem movements within a culture.
Yes.
I feel so rushed because there's so much I want
I
to
know,
pull
me too.
apart.
I'm like, we need not
There's so much I want to pull apart because I think like, yes, I agree. Colonization is the first step and it's part of that liberation umbrella, right? Because the patriarchal capitalism, chattel slavery, calling indigenous people barbaric, separating us from our memory and our culture, dehumanization, assimilation, like that all is tools of control by colonial empire. But we do want to also, like while we're talking about liberation, like part of liberation is pulling us apart, but it's also building a new world, right? Because when we win this revolution, when we decolonize, when we are free, when we are liberated, we still have to have something to go to. And so the article really does focus on what dreams that we have. And so we have another quote to read to you all, and would like to end on a note of just what are we dreaming? And then hopefully we'll have like 2 minutes for Q&A. All right, I'll read this one. It says, the Zionist movement's imaginary of conquering and settling the Palestinian body is inseparable from the project of conquering and settling Palestinian land and erasing indigenous presence. Writes Nadira Shaluk Kevorkian, Sarah Mahmoud, and Sudakhnakhila and Jadalia. In an attempt to reclaim our bodies and by extension our lands, we ask all the interviewees in this article about the relationship between their bodies and the land. Our liberation requires that we reclaim our relationship to the land itself, navigate the ways in which it has changed, and continue to care for it in a new context. What are your dreams for a feminist future?
So I talked about memory, and talked about a bunch of things that are part of the feminist future. I think one of the things that we have to really think about are having radical friendships and accountability. One of the things that I think is really important is like having not only this analysis and this work constantly, because nobody is gonna give us liberation. We don't have to take it. Yes. Right? But in addition to that, like, what is this micro level person to person work that you're doing daily? And some of that is being able to like have close relationships with people who are gonna call you on your shit and tell you when you're getting your own way, and also expose you to new things, right? Like allow you to learn, allow you to grow, allow you to have difficult conversations. I know I will say she did not have wonderful conversations.
Yeah, we have a lot.
But that's growth, right? It's growth and it's expansion and it's
love.
It's love, and and I will say for me, like that has allowed me to like imagine a liberation that I don't think I could have imagined before, which is beautiful, right? That's amazing. So I would say that I think that's part of it, and I think really we need to be on accountability. I think we need to hold the long arc of memory. We need to not allow like things that have occurred in the past that are still affecting us to be forgotten. And we have to hold people and institutions accountable. They have to. Otherwise, we cannot move forward. And if we're still being affected by something, we can't move forward. If there's no accountability.
But I also think that's part of healing, right? Like a lot of the difficult conversations you and I have are about like the way the systems keep us separated.
Yes.
And how we navigate that.
Yeah.
I also think maybe I'll add to that is like we have to learn to be in community together. And the micro piece of relationship building is one way, but it's also reclaiming things for me that are indigenous, like growing. You're she knows my seed collection.
She has a beautiful farm, by the way.
I have 200 square feet of outside space.
It's great.
But this is one of the ways that I prepare myself and that I show love to my community, is making sure I can feed people, right? Feed my family. I have chickens that I grow both for meat and eggs on my tiny, tiny little space. And part of that for me is like I want to do that with people, right? I want to be in community with people. Like I see so many of your beautiful faces and like I never want to not see you all. Because this is liberation to me. And this is what a feminist future looks like when we are together. And when we can hold each other accountable and also begin to practice the ways that liberation looks like for us in our day-to-day living. Because I tell Meredith all the time, especially in the last 6 months, I've been feeling a lot like I'm in fight mode, and I do not want to be in fight mode for the rest of my life. Like, I want to laugh with my kid, I want to go outside with Noelle and hang out and pick berries, I want to go with Maya and make delicious desserts she makes, like, I want to do that stuff. But I cannot do that comfortably, knowing that the cheese that Maya and I eat for the dessert is being forced out of basically slavery by underpaid immigrants who are, brought to this country. And there's a dairy farm in Ohio that got raided because they were using child labor. In Ohio, in 2023, I think is what? I mean, that to me is just, it keeps me up at night. So when I think of what a feminist future could look like for Palestine, I think of a liberation that we create together. That includes building and not just tearing down.
Yep. So we are at.
So Mark came in and said, "We have until 10 after, and then you'll have 5 extra minutes until the next session."
Amazing.
Yes.
Amazing.
And maybe really quick, I'll also add is like I think one of the things that gets taken from us in this colonized, very patriarchal world is that like everyone must have like a talent they can monetize. But like as I'm sitting around in this room. I'm just like, there's so much talent here. Like, I've seen you guys give public comment, make beautiful art, cook delicious things, amazing storytelling. If you've not seen American play, you're missing out. And I just think about how none of y'all make any money off of that. But how every single one of those skills is so desperately needed. Do you know how many banners Dawn has dropped? In the last 6 months, along with you all people. I can't even tell you. And I get to see that beautiful, beautiful, beautiful skill and talent because of the liberation work. Not because we go to a 9 to 5, right? And I'm just like so thankful to get to see that. And that is the future, that's the dream that I have, that we can always live in that.
instead of the bride.
Yes.
Oh, that's
So since we have an extra 10,
yes.
let's just open it up for a conversation. Are there anything, what's percolating on your mind about feminist futures? What does it look like to you?
I actually have more of a question.
Yeah.
I understand having hard conversations, especially when you're in a safe place of like your friends and family having those tough conversations, but when you're in like a academic setting where you don't trust the people around you, or in like a social setting, how do you bring up those conversations without being too like too reserved? That way the conversation isn't as effective, or you're like too outwardly about it and then it just kind of turns people away from what you're saying.
So I have an opinion about that. Okay. So I think for me personally, I think if you're in an academic setting, first of all, academia is violent as fuck, right? I'm not gonna hold you. Like that's my personal opinion, right? It is. We take what we need from it, and then we move on. But it's violent. So my first thing would say, like, make sure that you're safe. And my second thing would be like, do you have allies in the room? Before you start a hard conversation in a place, particularly where in academia you are not in control of your fate, right? And so I think that that's something super to be thinking about. Make sure you have allies in the room. And that doesn't mean don't do it. I think it just means assess. Because one of the things, unfortunately, that happens in academia is that we're seeing, and honestly, before now that it's been even more publicized, there's always been the case that academia can be such can be so tough on shutting down any difficult conversation, just because of that power hoarding, that resource hoarding, and because of people just don't want that, right? And so again, that's my personal opinion. You work in academia,
Yeah.
you said.
I'll also say you asked the wrong people, because you're not quiet. I feel like the two of us can be quite outspoken, but I think that's part of the love that we hold through accountability.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's the ticket. Everything Meredith said 100% right. And I also want to acknowledge that my place in academia has a different power relationship because I'm a tenured faculty member. But oftentimes I come to conversation with a lot of clarity about what I want in that moment and strategy towards how to get it. And it means that I might walk into a meeting with a million things to say, but I just keep saying the one thing over and over and over and over again because I know that's the thing that will get me to my goal. And I think college campus, especially right now, especially around the issue of Palestine, have upped the violence. I have never, and I've been organizing, particularly when I was in college, and on college campuses for a long time, I have never, those two students at Berkeley that got assaulted by their law professor, that is ridiculous. But it also means that something's working. When you're agitating people, you see those people agitated, something is working. But I think assessing your situation, having a goal, and having a strategy is how you get to where you want for your goal. So if it's an individual conversation with a professor who has said something Zionist in class, if accountability is your goal, you only need to say one thing. What you said is harmful. And just say it over and over again. You don't have to do anything else. If it's to agitate, then you've got to gather people and protest, right? If that's your goal, is to agitate and hold the university system accountable, then maybe it's a protest. But it just depends. And then the last thing I'll say is an assessment of safety, and also, what are you willing to let go of? Because if you are in liberation work, there will always be casualties. And sometimes that casualty might be your job. And if you're not willing to have that, to do that, then just know it. Know it going into it. And that's where allies in the room can be really helpful. I don't know if any of my students are in here, maybe Noelle is once a student of mine. You might have a professor who's an ally who's willing to speak up because they have that more power, and then you're protected, and they can do the speaking up for you. And there are always people willing to do that. And if you have more questions about specific situations, someone contact. This case is a unique place for sure.
Yeah, please.
No, I think what you said kind of resonated with me. And I went to case as well, and I got into some trouble. And I would just say, give yourself grace. Because I hurt my own self by just fighting so hard and not using the love, the community I had around me, and just telling them like I can't show them. And so even speaking up in a classroom and your voice shakes, like just give yourself grace. Because I had to learn that. I'm still learning.
Give yourself grace, because if you don't, if you're not, first of all, prepared, like what am I willing to lose? Who are my allies? What does my community look like if I do lose something like my job? That preparation is so important. And sometimes you have to learn. I had to learn in jail that I was okay with losing my job while I was sitting there, but had to make the assessment also of how I felt about my own character. Because once you get that criminal label, for example, you have to, sometimes you're going to be working alone to build yourself up. Hopefully you're not, because you have a community in place to build yourself up, to hold yourself accountable, but also everybody. But I had a question, and I'm sorry I spoke directly after you, but you had a question too, so I love that you said that you have to figure out what it sounds like you're saying you have to figure out what your priorities are. And I really struggle, like when I think of going to my elected officials. What do there's so many things I want to see accomplished, and I don't even know where to start on the issue. Obviously ceasefire, stop the bombing, but do you have tools that help you to figure out on a daily basis or a monthly basis what seems doable, what's too much? Like, do you have any advice after such a long time? And same question to you.
I think I learned this from Palestine, like being a refugee and working with people in refugee camps. You alone will not win liberation. No one action that you engage in is going to be the thing that tips the scale that causes liberation. And I think a lot of us, like especially because right now, we're watching a genocide unfold. It is the first time a genocide has ever been live televised. And one of the ways that we deal with that pain is action. So sometimes we can get caught up in the action, not only because it's important for liberation, but because it's also soothing to ourselves for watching this thing. But none of us, not a single one of us will achieve liberation alone, and no single action by any of us will achieve liberation alone. So when you sit down and you think about priorities, for me, I wish I had like a toolkit. Maybe we should actually come up with one. Maybe. I mean, I think that's a good one, but I sit and I ask myself, like, what do I have capacity for in this moment? And sometimes that capacity is calling other people in my community to do X, Y, and Z. Or to share knowledge I have so that people who do have capacity can take it and run with it. And sometimes it's just like showing up to things. I mean, I know you do all the time. You are everywhere, and I deeply appreciate that.
So are you.
Yeah. So like that. I mean, like those are the things that you're capable of. Do it. If you have an idea, sometimes ideas die, and that is okay because it's not the right time, or it's not the right place, or we don't have the right things in place for it. But sometimes an idea will take off. So sometimes it's about like prioritizing by what you have in the moment. And then the last thing I'll say about this is I like to sit down and reflect on like what is my theory of change, and like what do I really believe and can align my skills to towards that action of liberation. And that helps me say no to things that don't align with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So, but that requires so much reflection, which in a colonial and capitalist system, we rarely have time for.
We're all ambitious, right?
Yeah.
That long arc of memory that you talk about, it gives, I think that we also carry within ourselves all of the goals and ambitions and all the inspiration that was handed down to us. So we're brimming with like the excitement, but channeling that into something that, and I have to stop myself and say, I'm not responsible for everything. I can't force my House rep to do what I want them to do, but I appreciate your comment about the memory thing because it's good. You just feel it.